Okay, well, thank you, huge crowd, for coming tonight to the PowerPoint presentation on what is an optimal sustainable population for Vermont. This is kind of a summary of our report by the same name, only done in a PowerPoint presentation. Thanks to Mark and the rest of you that helped me put this presentation together. I appreciate it very much, and I welcome any feedback that you have after you've seen it as to how we might improve this. And thank Jerome for being here tonight from Orca to record it. And hopefully we'll get it up on YouTube at some point after he has a chance to edit it. So we'll just get started here. So this is the population stability for a sustainable future for Vermont. And 2 years ago, we did a report on what is an optimum sustainable population for Vermont. And we are the first political entity in the world, as far as can be determined, certainly in the United States, and probably in the world, to make a projection as to what is an optimal sustainable population for that political entity, be it a state, a province, a country, whatever. So we're very pleased to have done this groundbreaking report, and it's already received some 3,000 downloads from people all over the world. So it is making some kind of an impression that's out there. So the question becomes, why the heck did we do this report? Why do a report on what is a sustainable population for Vermont when we're kind of the second most rural state in the country? But the reason we did this report was that in 1973, the Vermont Natural Resources Council did what was probably the first report in the world, again, about population growth, and it was called the Population Policy for Vermont. And it's just an absolutely amazing report. It was done back in the old days without any technology or anything, and the final report was mimeographed, and it became very hard to find copies. But we were able to find a copy, and if you read that report, which is now on our website, you'll be amazed at the content. So much detail and so much projection about the future and what's going to happen if Vermont keeps on growing its population. And at that point in time, in the 1970s, Vermont was at the population growth issue was at the top of the agenda for the environmental movement. And politicians were talking about it, and environmentalists were talking about it. And that's why the NRC put out this report in 1973, because the interstate highway system had just been completed in Vermont, and people, the hippies and so forth, backlanders were coming to Vermont, and the environmentalists beginning to get worried, gee, what's going to happen if our population keeps on growing? And so we, 40 years later, decided to do our report. And the reason was that this report that the NRC did said, we must determine Vermont's carrying capacity. And carrying capacity was the words that were used back then. And people would say carrying capacity, applies to deer herds and other forms of wildlife, but it also applied to people. What population level can be carried in Vermont? And so this report said we should determine what the carrying capacity of Vermont is. But unfortunately, that carrying capacity study was never done. So 40 years later, on the anniversary of that report, we decided, well, let's do that report finally. Only instead of calling it carrying capacity, we decided to call it sustainability. And I would just like to point out, again, as I mentioned, back then, environmentalists were very concerned. Vermont had the highest per capita zero population growth chapter in the United States. Isn't that kind of hard to believe? The largest per capita zero population growth chapter in the United States. And they were so concerned about the environment back then that they did what I think was probably the first environmental action in Vermont. I can't document it, but I'll bet $100 it was the first environmental action. And what they said was, let's take people out to Sloop Island. Do you folks know where Sloop Island is? Phil does. He sails out there. Off of Charlotte. Just a little distance off Charlotte, the ferry. Tiny little island. And they said, we'll fill it up with people, and this is what the world will look like if we keep on growing the population. And man, how right they were 40 years later. They were so right. Now, of course, there are many cartoons showing people falling off the earth because the earth is so crowded. And I should put one of those cartoons up here to demonstrate what they were all about. So Vermont population now is 626,000. Back then it was 400,000. So we've grown by almost 50% in just those few years. Our total fertility rate is actually pretty low. Replacement level is only about 1.7. But at least the last decade, we slowed down a little bit. The last decade we were growing by 17,000, and projected we could grow to be 712,000 by 2030, and perhaps 1 million by 2100. And I don't think that's at all unrealistic now, because we know that California is facing extreme mega droughts, and Florida's going to be flooded in part, and people are going to move here as environmental refugees. No question about it. And I'm sure Phil, who studies real estate, can probably speak to that later. But Vermont's population is going to grow. We're stable right now, but no question. So the first part of our study was, what is an optimal population for Vermont? So we had two different categories, an optimal population and a sustainable population. An optimal population is defined as what is the most favorable or desirable or the best. So that's kind of a subjective criteria. You can't measure it in hard data. It's just what people think. So those are what we call subjective indicators. And we have a variety of them. And there's like democracy. And all of these indicators were written by volunteers, except one, who are experts in the field. And we've got two of them here. Carmen wrote the first indicator, Ecological Footprint, and Mark wrote the forestry indicator. And they all did a great job, and Carmen would set the model with the ecological footprint. She was the first one to do it. Even though she's not a scientist, she did the research and worked very hard and did the first one. Those are both objective, but the happiness indicator, the person who wrote that was a volunteer and said, I can't come up with a figure. If you're in New York City, maybe you love New York City and you're happy there. So I just can't come up with it. But, other people did come up with some values. And so we had these different subjective indicators that you can debate. What does things like scenic beauty really mean? And how do you evaluate that? Well, to me, scenic beauty is extremely important. I live in the rural town of Washington, Vermont. And that hill up there, part of that hill is some of my land. And that house that you're looking at used to be just borders from my land. I used to cross-country ski down that hill, across where that house now is. And if you look up at it from 110, and I realize this isn't the greatest of photos, but if you look up there now, if you're from New York City, you would say, oh, that's beautiful, what's wrong with that? But when I drive down that road now, when I look up there, and I say, oh my God, that used to be so beautiful. And now you look up there, and where does your eye immediately go? It goes right to the house. So it's not, from my point of view, it's not nearly as beautiful as it was. And I can show you many places in Washington, some places now where the view has just been totally obliterated. So yeah, it's a subjective indicator, but I think many of us would agree on at least most of us Vermonters would say, yeah, that's much more pretty than downtown New York City. And also poverty. This is kind of subjective. And we actually did that, we added that as an indicator in 2014, because 2014 was the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty. I imagine, at least the older people, remember when President Roosevelt declared the war on poverty. But if you look at the data, despite what everybody says, we got to grow the population. That's good for the economy. The data for the war on poverty shows that the poverty level has remained basically the same. It's still about 12 or 13%. And if it wasn't for all the social benefit programs of our government, people would be suffering a lot more than they already are. I know in my town of Washington, I see a lot more poverty, a lot more dilapidated houses than I used to see. And so I took this photograph, you've probably seen them out there on the Barry Montpelier Road going into Price Chopper. And I just stopped and asked him one day, gee, can I take a picture of you? And he said, yeah, sure, fine. So poverty has not improved. And then we had another indicator at the last minute, spiritual connection. Now, who would think there's any connection between spirituality and population growth? But the person that wrote this is a minister, Reverend Greg Wilson, who lives in a big city in Florida. And he has a summer place in Stratford, Vermont. And he'll be up here at the end of this month and through September. And he just loves it up here. And this is where he sleeps, this thing right here. And he says, boy, I feel a lot more spiritually connected to the broader world and to the environment being up here than I do in my big city in Florida, even though he gets out to the parks and whatnot in Florida. He says, I just love coming up here, and sometimes I'll be on a little path that comes up to our place that's off the grid, and as you can see, very primitive, and sometimes I'll encounter a deer on the trail, and I'll make eye contact with a deer that's 15 feet away. Wow, that is so powerful, spiritually connected to the greater world. So then the next category that we did was on the sustainable. And this is objective group of indicators that you can actually measure. Now you can debate with the people about who did the measuring, whether scientifically they came up with the right figures or not. But I think if you read the report and see what they have to say, you'll think, they're probably pretty right. So so before we did the sustainable indicator, we said, well, we have to define what we mean by sustainable. What's the definition of sustainable? Because you look up the traditional definition of sustainable, and basically the environmental tradition at least says sustainable means that people living in the present generation will live in a manner and style that will not harm future generations. Well, that's pretty vague. That's pretty, doesn't have any real good parameters to it. So we came up with a new definition. And it's very unique, very strong. And we said there's three things to being truly sustainable. One is you have to define the area that you want to talk about being sustainable. You can't just say, oh, we're going to rely on the earth, and the earth is going to be sustainable. That's not sustainable to keep importing oil or bananas or whatever from all over the earth. So you have to define the area, be it Vermont or the Champlain Valley or whatever. We're going to depend largely on that, talk largely about that area. The second thing is we're going to depend largely on the renewable resources of that area to be sustainable. Renewable resources, whether it's for our agriculture or for our energy or to meet our needs, we're going to largely depend on renewable resources, both for our inputs, food, energy, or whatever, and to absorb our outputs, be it solid waste or carbon dioxide or whatever. So that's the second thing that's unique about this definition. And then the third thing that's really very unique is that's going to apply to all life native to that area. Because usually when we talk about sustainable, you see all these institutions and environmental organizations or whatnot, they use sustainable. But they just use it in general terms, and they don't ever say, well, gee, shouldn't wolves have a right to live someplace in Vermont, or at least if not in Vermont, northern New England? They're native, shouldn't they have a right? And so we say it should apply to all life native to that area. So yeah, granted, Burlington can't be sustainable in terms of most of these definitions, but if you took the Champlain Valley, Burlington as part of the Champlain Valley, probably could be pretty sustainable in most respects. Not entirely, but could be sustainable in that way. So this is our unique definition, and we're now in the process of trying to encourage other environmental organizations and businesses and educational institutions to adopt this definition. It's been a hard task. A few have, but most say, oh, that's too idealistic or that's too political. We can't go there. We don't want to adopt this definition. Even 350 Vermont, I tried to get them to adopt it. You think they would be the first. And, I even went to their board and talked at a board meeting. They finally decided, no, we can't do that. Even though what could help most in reducing our carbon emissions than living more sustainably. So a variety of measurable objective indicators, and they all have 2 or 3 pages in the report, and they all have quite varying numbers. And if you go by one of the most scientific ones that is scientifically definable, ecological footprint, Carmen came up with 150,000 people. Now, an ecological footprint means that if we're going to support the people here, and Carmen, I know you can't remember, and I can't remember either, but every person, I think, has an ecological footprint in Vermont. It's something like 8 or 10 acres. I mean, to sustain us, it takes 8 or 10 acres of biodiversity and biocapacity and resources, water and so forth to feed us and meet our needs and so forth. That's ecological footprint. And we, of course, we have our United States population has one of the largest ecological footprints in the world. Then if you're poor and live in India, your personal ecological footprint might only be an acre or 2. But on the other hand, India has got however many millions, so the total ecological footprint of India is quite large. So I commend Carmen for coming up with that figure and her courage and her insight in doing that. And so you can see we got quite a range there of objective indicators. And some people just said, well, probably about our current population is good for those objective indicators. And just to show some photos to illustrate this, one of the three big issues now that's going on in the environmental movement in Vermont is the decline in forest cover, and they're putting more emphasis on actually forest fragmentation. And so they're focusing on water quality, and you all know about Lake Champlain cleanup. They're focusing on energy and moving to renewable energy. And now, just within the last year or so, the third big environmental concern is, geez, our forests are becoming fragmented, and our forests are declining in cover. And that is a major concern. And so I'm part of the Sierra Club, and we just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I think it's tomorrow or Thursday. Mike Snyder, do you know about this, is going to speak at the State House on a report the Agency of Natural Resources is doing on forest fragmentation in Vermont. So what's happening? People are subdividing, building like the hillside thing I showed you, houses, and subdividing the land. And that's causing forest fragmentation, which then results in less wildlife habitat and makes it more difficult for some species to migrate from one large tract of land to another. So it's a major, major concern that's now beginning to surface in Vermont. And actually for the first time in over about a century and a half, prior to the last 20 years, forest cover was increasing in Vermont, because at one point it was down to about 25%. And then as the hillside farms got abandoned, forest cover came back in, went up to about 80%, and now it's declining. And I forgot what the exact number is. I think it's now about 75% forested. And of course, all of it's directly connected to population growth. And it also affects cropland. Much of our subdivisions are going into agricultural land. And you can actually see the figures here of how the cropland is declining. It's pretty dramatic. Phil, if you know anything, you may probably know some of the stuff better than I do. But you have anything to add to this way, feel free to jump in here. And I just added this picture. It didn't show up very well, but the top one is 1937 of Taft's Corners. Almost no sprawl there. And in 1962, you begin to see a little sprawl. And now, as you all know, Taft's Corners is even worse than this in 2007. Just huge, huge sprawl. And of course, you can say the same thing many other places. When I moved to Vermont, there was no sprawl up in Berlin. Nothing whatsoever. Now it's all sprawl up there. And now they're going to add another big box store up there. I forgot what it is. One of the big box stores. So, all connected to population growth. And even renewable energy. I'm trying to do my part. I'm driving my electric vehicle and my solar panel, but we keep pushing for renewable energy sources, but that's not even begin to make up the difference if we keep on growing the population by 2 or 3 million people a year in the United States. There's no way we're going to convert to renewable energies. That in itself is energy intensive. And I bought at least my first electric vehicle 3 years ago. And then I began to read that if you drive an electric vehicle, in order to make up for the greenhouse gas emissions, you've got to drive it for about 3 years in order to make up for the greenhouse gas emissions already generated just producing the batteries in the car itself. 3 years. I thought I was doing a good deed. And now, of course, recent years, water quality. I can well remember going to St. Albans Bay and as a young man in Vermont and swimming in St. Albans Bay. And now probably you can tell me, Kathy, can you swim at all in St. Albans Bay? No, every year it's algae bloom, right? And of course, much of that, I guess, comes from agricultural runoff. But not so in Burlington. Much of that comes from impervious surface runoff, right? And impervious surfaces in Vermont and other runoff have just increased dramatically. And even industrial agriculture, I would say, as a result of population growth. Because we keep saying, we got more people, we got to feed more people. And so we move from these small hillside farms, that were generally, I think, pretty well environmentally sound, to the huge industrial agricultural farms, so we could feed a growing population. And the same with impervious surface. I can see runoff. I go up to Jail Branch, Eastbury, and on a Jail Branch there's a dirt, mud parking lot right up against the Jail Branch. It's at least a half acre in size, and I just can't imagine how much soil must be, like now, running off into the Jail Branch of the Winooski River. So you take all these indicators, the subjective indicators and the objective indicators, and you come up with an average of about 500,000, which is about 125,000 less than we have now. However, we use Carmen's indicator, which I would love to have used, 150,000. Man, the population would never say, "Oh, you guys are nuts. What are you thinking?" So instead of taking the most scientifically sound indicator We said, oh, we'll just average them all. Came up with an average of 500,000 acres. So the average 500, the current is 626, and the difference is 126,000, which isn't a huge difference, but it's significant. So the whole point is we really should try to stabilize our population and maybe gradually decrease the population. And so we did a little separate work on just Washington County, this being kind of a Washington County focus here tonight, and tied it in with the Vermont population. And you can see that for several decades, the Vermont population was relatively stable. And I moved here in the 60s when it was still like it was back in the 30s and 40s pretty much, and even earlier. But then, as I said, because of the interstate highway system and back to land movement, and people wanted to move here because they wanted to get out of New York City or wherever. The population spiked, and then Washington, if we had a separate graph of Washington County, it would show that spiked too. But when it's plotted in the same graph as Vermont, it doesn't show quite as dramatically. But if you look at say 1930, 1950, and the total numbers, it's increased by about 40% in recent decades. So it is significant how even Washington County has increased in population. The thing environmentalists never talk about is, oh well, we're a green state. We live responsibly, and we're doing the right thing. Well, nobody ever asks, what's our impact on the total Earth? And our impact is pretty significant. Even though we've got a relatively small population, we still have a big impact. We import 95% of our food. That number is improving somewhat, but still about 95%. We import 100% of our fossil fuels that come from someplace else. Most of our material goods, which used to be made in Vermont, are now imported. And of course, we export 100% of our carbon emissions and probably roughly 50% of our solid waste that can't go into landfills. So we have a big impact on the rest of the Earth. And we need to acknowledge and recognize that. Maybe not in total, but we do our fair share. And of course, now we're having that impact, let's just climate change is having an impact on Vermont. And this is, I think this is down in, Yeah, one of the rivers. So climate change is having an impact on Vermont, and we certainly do our fair to contribute, probably per capita more than average because we drive more to get to work and to get to shopping and whatnot. So, and if we keep on growing the population, it's just going to make it all much harder to reduce our carbon emissions. So we need to ask what's important to you. Is it sprawl and traffic congestion? I know that's certainly important to me. I had to take the bus today from Barrie to Formula Ford because I blew out two of my tires on my electric vehicle a couple weeks ago, just going through a little pothole. It took them 2 weeks to get the tires replaced, and I took the bus and I just stood on the in downtown Barrie on the street, which I'd never done before. Just flabbergasted by the traffic going by. When you're driving the traffic, it doesn't impact you that much, but when you watch all these trucks going by and cars and large vehicles, wow. So it really impacts us. The noise and light pollution. From my house in Washington, I used to be able to look and see, at one point, Mount Mansfield had lights on their ski areas. I don't know if any of you remember that or not, but they used to light the Mount Mansfield ski area so you could ski at night. And I used to be able to look at my house from Washington, see the lights on the side of Mount Mansfield. Now I don't see the lights on well, of course they stopped the lights on Mount Mansfield, but all I see is a big white glow over Barrie and Montpelier. The night sky isn't dark anymore. God, it's so sad. So yeah, for most people, they probably aren't aware of light pollution. But you know, it impacts our quality of life. Water quality, we've already talked about. Climate change, I don't need to talk about that. You're all aware of that. And scenic views, we did talk about that. So, you know, what are you concerned about? Me, I'm concerned about all of those things. And even democratic government, as towns get bigger, more towns move to Australian ballot and they no longer have town meetings. You know, and what does that do to our government? When people can't come together in town meeting and debate the issues and discuss what's going on and meet each other and connect and so forth. And I just love town meetings, and my own time of year I connect with other people in town. So what do we want for Vermont's future? Well, that's where I used to live. My first house I owned on Susie Wilson Road, which is between the city of Winooski and the village of Essex Junction. Susie Wilson Road. My first house I bought with 14 acres of land for $12,000. This was all open, and it was just wonderful. We used to cross-country ski here, and people would actually trap on my land right behind the house there. I never knew about trapping, but they'd come and, hey, can we trap on your land? And then the brook over there was beautiful. And now, a few years ago, I went up and took a photograph from the same spot, and that's what it looks like, the same spot now. Have any of you been to Susie Wilson Road recently? You know where it is? Yeah. Now it's all subdivision, all commercial development, huge commercial development. And I understand now they've just put in a mini electric race car track on Susie, mini electric race car track. So instead of kids going out of doors and enjoying, we used to lock the doors, say, hey, you kids can't come in, you gotta stay outside. Now, instead of staying outside, where do they go? Electric indoor car track. No wonder people are disconnected from nature. So what can you do? Well, the thing for you to do is talk about the elephant in the room. And boy, it has become an elephant in the room. It's just such a shame. Back in the 70s, we'd have open discussions about it and talk about it. And now even environmental organizations won't talk about it. Go to their websites, you won't see anything about overpopulation or population development, except for the Vermont chapter of Sierra Club. They have a population committee, but they're the only environmental and the Center for Biological Diversity. They're the only two organizations that'll talk about it. And so talk about it. I hope you yourselves will speak out about population growth. If you haven't seen that book yet, Overdevelopment, Overpopulation, Overshoot, we've got 2 copies over here. Thumb through that book. I just went through it page by page a couple nights ago, and the photographs, the 300 photographs in there are just stunning. I mean, I was almost discouraged the first time I looked through it. I just went, oh, I can't take this. I finally said, I got to go through it page by page. And, you know, I wonder, is there any picture in Vermont here? Because Bill Ryerson funded it. And Tom Butler, who is from the Foundation for Deep Ecology, lives in Huntington, and he did the book. There's no pictures of Vermont, from Vermont in here, for good reason. There's nothing as horrendous that you see in this book. I mean, you look at it and say, oh my God, how can anybody do this to the earth? And so just thumb through that book before you leave. And if you are willing to speak out on population growth, or have spoken out about population growth, I'd be thrilled to give you a copy of the book. I know some of you already got a copy, but I've got 2 copies left. I started with 15, and I'd love to see some of you folks take those last 2 copies. They're free, but if you don't take a copy, just thumb through it. And we promote the concept of replace yourself only once with a male or female. You know, we used to put the burden on female and say only have 2 children. Well, no, only replace yourself once, whether you're male or female. So if you're a couple and you have one child, you've each replaced yourself half a time. And then if you separate, one of you gets repartnered, you've already replaced yourself half time. And if the new partner hasn't had any children, then he or she gets to, have another child. So, you've only each one has replaced themselves once. So you have to think ahead about replacing yourself only once, or no more than once. And ask yourself also any connection between this problem and population growth. And if you look at any problem, any environmental problem, and most social problems, there's definitely a connection. You can name it, and there's a connection. Like, as we talked about, the algae bloom in Lake Champlain. You hear them talk all about development and agriculture and so forth, but they never ever mention, population growth was a contributor to this. It certainly is, and it's certainly going to make it very hard. And I just spoke a few weeks ago down the conference in Chesapeake Bay, and they're facing the same problem. This huge development down Chesapeake Bay that's pretty much destroyed the water quality of Chesapeake Bay. And then ask, is this issue going to get any better or any worse with a growing population? And of course, the answer is growing population is only going to make it worse. So we have to look at what are the true causes of growth. And one is we have a culture of growth. It wasn't always this way, but in the last, I'd say last 40 or 50 years, we said we have to keep on growing. It's good for the economy. It's good for our income, which has been proven to be totally false. Income inequality and poverty have only gotten worse, but so we have to get off this culture of growth forever, because on a finite planet, it's just, you can't grow forever on a finite planet. Somehow we've got to change this thinking of growth forever. Second factor is migration, and that's even a bigger elephant in the room. But if we're objective and realistic, we can't just keep bringing in, every year we bring in 1 million or 2 million immigrants, and only a couple 100,000 people leave the United States each year. And that's just unsustainable, and particularly in a place like California, which just a few decades ago only had 3 million people. And now how many people does California have? Anybody? 38 million. 38 million in a few decades. And what are they facing? Severe drought. And they're still saying, we got to keep on growing the population in California. Wow. Where's the thinking? And of course, unplanned births are another factor. So we have to look at the causes and be realistic and talk about them. And then we need to work on recommendations. And this report that we did has many recommendations. We won't go into them all today, but so just pass this around. This has got the indicators on one side and the recommendations on the other side. We won't go into that recommendations because they're very detailed. But we do have explicit recommendations, such as, we talked about the individual level. Municipal level is a little harder, but improved zoning, questioning whether we really need to bring in a big subdivision or whatever. The state level, one recommendation might be to say, okay, you can only deduct income taxes for 2 children, and you can't have an income tax deduction for more than 2, which seems perfectly reasonable. And then national, of course, support family planning and those kinds of things. So we just did the first in the world, as far as I know, little survey where people in Washington County got a chance just to respond. Do they want their town or city to stay about the same size, grow a little bigger, grow a little smaller. We had no idea how this would turn out. Totally experimental. As far as I know, nobody's ever done it before. And thanks to Mark, he got the survey monkey up there, and didn't get as many responses as I had hoped for. I'd hoped maybe we get 100, but we did get some, and it gave us, an experiment in doing this, and maybe we might try it again. My thought now is maybe if we just did it for one community, like Northfield, and really plugged it in Northfield, we might get more response and better response, because then you could just focus on one community. So I thank you for being here tonight and talking about the elephant in the room.